Now tonight we have Paul. I don't know if you've got Willie on the.
I haven't yet, but I will.
Okay. Well, trust me. There's a dog named Willie who's a large dog, but he's down there. Paul hasn't shown him to you yet, and he's here along with his person, David Jakes. I understand we can't say owner anymore. It's not politically correct. His human companion. And David has a new book out. It is called Dog Park. It has to do with the dog park. And this is your first published work of prose, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
He's been here before as a poet, has 2 works of poetry out. And so without further ado, I will introduce you and let you and Willie tell us about life in the dog park.
I'll give that back. Thanks a lot, Gail, and I want to thank Lois and Mike and Paul and Gail and Lois, Paul, Mike, and Gail.
We're the team.
For this nice evening, you guys. I feel like I should pick the dog up and show him.
Can you get him to stand up?
See what happens here. I don't want to break.
I don't think so.
Oh, there we go.
He says this is so undignified. I can understand.
All right, there we go.
Oh, good boy, Willie.
All right.
As you can see, Willie is a golden retriever.
He's a golden retriever. Does anybody have trouble with him? Allergies or anything like anything? Because my truck is right out here. I can just get him right. All right. Well, thanks a lot. Okay, I'm going to start out. I'm just going to. It's a short story that is almost a novella, or a novella that's not quite a short story, or So here we go. It's about a dog park, and I wrote it last summer. And I thought I would read the beginning of it to describe the narrator a bit to you, so you get a feeling for him. And then I'm just going to go into kind of the culmination of it, actually, which is further in, obviously. And it's kind of entertaining, that little section. And then that'll be probably about it. So here we go. Okay, this is called this section. This little book, by the way, has these nice woodcuts, like divided. It's the little chapters. There's I don't know how many chapters, but they're like this, and they're interspersed at each chapter, and they're really beautiful. And I have no idea who the artist was. They're public domain, and they're received from the internet. And I wish I had met that person. And people often say, "Did you do these?" And I often say, if I did, I wouldn't be writing, because they're pretty good, I think. So anyway, here we go. Okay, so it's Dog Park. It's dedicated to this guy here, and it's also to our friends at Berkshire County. So, getting there. If you ever drive into our town and you are at a light and you get behind a small pickup and the light changes, but the pickup doesn't move, that's James, and he is probably asleep. Don't worry, though. He's got his foot on the brake and his truck probably won't drift. He claims he can tell the color of the light when it changes through his closed eyelids, but give him a gentle honk on your horn just in case. You see, James works nights at the college as a janitor. Sometimes he goes in when it's dark. It's a lonely job. He works alone, mopping and cleaning the locker rooms. Now and then security walks through, but to him, they sometimes seem like his jailers, with their keys jangling and speaking in loud voices, leaving him alone to his thoughts, wondering what he has done wrong to deserve this. He does get to bring his dog, Benny. Benny is a 4-year-old golden retriever who used to follow James everywhere when he first started the job. But James darted around so much, forgetting to get enough rags or unplugging the vacuum, that Benny has given up following and parks himself in the corner and sleeps. In the morning, after James has returned home, slept, he still gets up early, goes out to his wood shop in his garage and starts working. He's not greatly accomplished at woodworking, but he owns a few machines and is always trying to get better at it. This summer, he had taken on the challenge of trying to build a door for a family out in Illinois, where James is originally from. The door is about done by now, and he is pleased with it. It's not a fancy door, but he's decided to undertake this venture because it involves power tools he owns but avoids using because he has never really learned to use them right. This way he figures he'll be forced to gain some familiarity. He spends a few hours in there listening to the radio and sweating over his progress. Benny, once again, is parked outside and waits until this is over. Sometimes James wonders what Benny thinks he is doing in there, and sometimes James wonders what he himself is doing in there. He's not very good at woodworking, groping in the half-light for his boards. He once made a chair that had a half circle of wood in it, and it reminded a friend of a toilet, so she called it the toilet chair. James eventually had to put it out back because no one ever sat in it, and he was afraid someone might try and relieve themselves through it, so it became a part of his wood pile. After being in the wood shop, James usually puts Benny in his truck, and the two drive over to the other side of town to the dog park. To get there, though, they have to pass through the town and then out past the airport. James had always had a strange disconnection with the town. And then it goes on. I'm just going to stop there. You get a feeling for who the narrator is a little bit, I hope. What the story basically is. It's about James, but it's also about two women that bring their dogs to the dog park, and it's sort of their sort of way of trying to get off into adulthood from being young women. And there's certain complications in the way for that, as we all have experienced in our lives and stuff. So the first story is the story of Claire. And I think I'll read a little of that, and then I'll jump into the kind of the culmination of it. So, James first met Claire during the winter of that year. He had come to the dog park in his truck with Benny. It was afternoon, and he was alone in the park, standing in the recent snow that had fallen from a bad storm the night before. Nobody wants to hear about the bad storm right now. But anyway, I wish I could talk to you about summer right now. Maybe we'll get more into that, but. Okay, so a bad storm the night before. So no one was there because the weather was bad and because most people couldn't get in because their cars couldn't manage the conditions. James would throw the ball to Benny and the ball would disappear into the snow. Sometimes Benny would find it excitedly, his tail flickering while putting his nose under and sniffing. And sometimes he wouldn't, and James would have to trudge down to the other end and kick and poke until a trace of yellow would appear among the frozen snow crust. As James was there, he noticed car tracks that led to a car that had come in earlier and had been driven down a slope and abandoned. Its windows were open. It was a sobering sight, not just to see an abandoned car there, but James right away had another reason. He started to get a sinking feeling he might be asked to help tow the car out. He could tell it was probably owned by some college kids who went to school in the area. The whole situation had a college-age look and feel to it, and James wasn't pleased. He weighed the thought of escaping before anyone showed up, but stayed, continuing to throw and find the ball for Benny. Pretty soon, 3 college-aged women appeared, their jackets open, cheeks red. They waved to James, and then hesitantly he drifted over to them and began asking a few questions. They explained they had tried to get their car out and couldn't. They had tried to call but couldn't. Then they had tried to walk out to a nearby road but hadn't made it to a house. One young woman, the driver of the car, introduced herself to James as Claire. I knew this was a bad idea, she said, not quite meeting his gaze. James lost track of the intricacies of their stories because he knew what he would be doing next, and his whole afternoon was beginning to take a completely different shape than planned. But he also had a morbid curiosity to see how his own truck would perform. He hadn't yet tested it. He agreed to help and backed his truck down to the front of Claire's car. At first they tied some scarves and old clothes to the front and attached onto James' bumper. Don't try this. It never works. Anyway, so the girls got behind to push. James accelerated, tires spun, and the scarves and old clothes snapped right off. They met again, conjectured James had no rope, but he pulled his jumper cables out from behind his seat and tied them on. The girls got behind, Claire steered, the tires spun, engines raced in steam, the cables stiffened, and not much happened with their car. This went on for a while. James found himself underneath their cars, readjusting, retying the cables. The snow was cold, it had melted, his body was cold. He was often at the point of giving up and giving them a ride into town for a wrecker. But they started to make a little progress. Each time they revved out, they managed to gain a few feet and made it just enough for James to remain interested. They had spent a good hour and a half with maybe a third of the distance achieved, but they still hadn't made it to the crest of the hill. James sat in his truck, possibly to warm up, when he suddenly had an epiphany. He had been using his four-wheel drive option, obviously, but he hadn't tried his low-gear four-wheel drive option. Jumped out, motioned the girls to get back in position. Two weren't near and had to be rounded up like stray cattle because they had lost their faith. Soon he jumped back in, dropped it down, and in one blast of spinning wheels, strained cables, broken scarves, and shirts, the car slid sideways a bit but came back almost the whole way up from down in that hole. The vehicles appeared on the road. Claire jumped out. James jumped out. The other girls caught up. No one could really believe it had happened. The girls stood around James, thanking him. Claire gushed, "I'm taking you out to dinner. What do you like?" James was pleased enough by the outcome and didn't want her to feel obligated. "Don't worry about it," he said. She tried to offer him some money. He refused. They said goodbye and drove away in separate directions. That was how James first met Claire in the winter. So that's a story of the beginning of the story of Claire, and I kind of don't really know what to read here, but I don't want to get too far. I mean, this book is so short that I could read the whole book, while we're here, but we don't want to.
Well, who's the other young lady?
Well, the other lady, we'll go into her now, and this is sort of the culmination of the whole thing and all. Her name was Davida, and let's see here. Let's see, so I think here we go. And okay, this is so Davida is pregnant, and she goes to the dog park, and she's Polish, of this Polish descent, and she's possibly an American citizen now, but she's of Polish descent, and she's young, and she's pregnant, and she goes to the dog park. So she's depressed, and she's depressed and pregnant, and so there's kind of a guy in here that's quite good with her at the dog park, and they sit on the bench, and they have these conversations, and they're all sitting around, and they're all listening, and everyone's kind of into this because she's depressed, and they're kind of he's bringing her kind of out of this sort of this funk that she's in for moments and stuff, and so it's quite exciting for them, and he's a chef, and he talks about food, and it's kind of his way of bringing them out is to talk about food. He's he's of French descent. Okay, so that kind of sets you up here a little bit. And his name is Pierre, and his dog is named Bon Appetit. But anyway, so another use for a newspaper. This is called this section. They had been sitting around most of the early morning. It had been a good morning. Almost everyone was there, the familiar faces, snouts, and tails. Carol and Tim were there. Both had gray hair and usually wore black. They were like salt and pepper shakers as they stood together on the high ground overlooking their dogs. Carol was a teacher, and during the summer had taken on the responsibility of being the informal manager of the dog park. She collected donations, made sure the garbage cans were emptied. She had spent her winters managing a classroom of rebellious high school teens, so she was certainly capable of handling the dog park in the summer. James thought those of us who were aware of her and her service were quite grateful. When Carol left, she wished everyone that morning to have a great day, which was well-meaning. But James mused to himself a little cynically what a great day would be to him. He thought he might open his mail and find it full of nothing but big checks, all written out to him. Then he would walk into town to the bank to deposit them. And as he passed the gas station, a guy would call out, "Hey, you want my car? I don't need it anymore. Go ahead. It's even got a full tank." Then as James was pulling out, a woman would run up to him and say, "My husband just left me and I need you." And they would drive off together to an undisclosed location. Just then, as James awakened from this fantasy, he looked up and saw Benny assuming his pooping position, as if Benny was sitting in a rocking chair. This simple achievement, thought James, would make his day great enough. He pulled a bag from his pocket and began walking in Benny's direction. As he walked, he passed Sal, the poet, who was there with her 2 huskies. James said hello and thought she was probably thinking something poetic. DaivdJaicksDogPark arrived and got slowly out of her car, her big belly causing her to list to one side. Pete called to her, "Hey, DaivdJaicksDogPark, you better leave your engine running." "Why?" someone said. "In case she starts to go into labor," Pete joked. Claire had arrived and sat down next to DaivdJaicksDogPark, who had made her slow way over to the bench. Claire had her head against DaivdJaicksDogPark's belly as she listened. Suddenly, Claire sat up and her eyes were like stars. "I just felt him," said Claire. DaivdJaicksDogPark smiled and looked down. "My baby has the hiccups," said DaivdJaicksDogPark. "Really?" said Claire. "Yes," said DaivdJaicksDogPark, smiling. James walked further away to clean up after Benny. Then as he went off to throw away the bag, James heard a high-pitched scream and the sounds of others in concern. At first he thought some dogs were in a fight or yelping. He looked back and saw people gathering around DaivdJaicksDogPark, who was now lying back with her legs up, and Jill was fanning her in big, broad sleeps with a local newspaper. People were running around DaivdJaicksDogPark and a small crowd had gathered. James ran back to see what he could do. "What happened?" he said. "It's DaivdJaicksDogPark and her water has broken," Rita answered. James looked down and saw the bench was glistening and shining where DaivdJaicksDogPark had been sitting. "Should we call out for help?" said James. "Good idea," said Ken, and James started out of the crowd, passing Pierre, who knelt beside DaivdJaicksDogPark and was smoothing her forehead with a damp cloth. DaivdJaicksDogPark looked up at the sky and her chest was heaving. She groaned. It seemed that most of them didn't know what to do. The usual nurses and retired nurses weren't present. Some of the usual loudmouths also seemed the most clueless, standing in the background, conjecturing, their hands in their pockets, arms folded. Ken had once heard that some of the obscure sections of a newspaper were good material to receive a baby in because they hadn't been touched by human hands and were quite clean. So he managed to interrupt Jill's fanning and set aside the sports section. "What do you think we ought to do?" Ken asked out loud. Right then, Sal, the poet, came bounding in. She knelt between DaivdJaicksDogPark's legs, lifted DaivdJaicksDogPark's dress up, and began to feel around DaivdJaicksDogPark's interior. "The baby is coming," Sal looked up and announced. DaivdJaicksDogPark's breathing had grown heavy, and Sal bent her legs higher. "All right, DaivdJaicksDogPark," she said. "This isn't going to be easy, but I want you to push. Push, DaivdJaicksDogPark, push." Most people had never even heard Sal speak, let alone suddenly move in and take command of the birth center. "Push, DaivdJaicksDogPark, push," Sal shouted. James was now running to the gate to get to his truck to make that call on his cell phone. He reached the second chain link handle and lifted it. The last gate closed behind. He ran to his truck, grabbed his cell phone, and began calling. "Hi, I'm at the dog park, and we have a birth going on." "No, it's a human birth. A young woman is giving birth." James looked back at the crowd. Everyone was huddled around DaivdJaicksDogPark, and it looked as though someone in a white shirt was giving her a bear hug. James turned back and finished the call. He hung up and grabbed a bandana out of his cap. He didn't know what it could be used for, but he grabbed it anyway. He started back inside the gate. He lifted the handle and one door closed. He lifted the handle of the next, and as it started to close, James heard a sound he had never heard before at the dog park. At first he thought a dog was in trouble or some birds were squawking, but it was the sound of an infant crying. He looked up. DaivdJaicksDogPark had delivered a baby boy. The gate softly closed behind him. James approached the group more slowly now. Everyone was crying. The baby was wrapped in the sports section of the local newspaper. The baby, who was wrapped in the sports section of the local newspaper, was now cradled in Pierre's arms. It was rocking him gently and already speaking to him about the merits of French cuisine. Way out in the middle of the park, James sat down on the ground, took his hat off, and looked out at the trees. Good God, he thought, what a morning. He had no idea what time it was, or where Benny was, or where anything really was. He was spent. He swept the sweat off his face with the shoulder of his shirt and looked out at the trees. He was a little contemplative, a little sad. All that time trying to adjust yourself to a new life, he thought. All that time not knowing. No wonder some women who are pregnant get depressed, he thought. All that time not knowing who is inside you or what it'll be like. The hardest part for Davida was now over, it seemed to him. At least now she could put her thoughts into action. Claire came up and sat down next to James. She'll probably make a fine mother, he said as he looked out at the trees. She seems to have taken it seriously. Claire nodded. They both looked off at the forest. Pete was the hero of the day, said Claire with some surprise. James looked over at her and said, what do you mean? It turned out Pete had gone to medical school when he was young and studied obstetrics. He dropped out, though, for unknown reasons and to become a lawyer instead. During Davida's delivery, Pete had been keeping a low profile, standing in the back with Roland and the others. When he saw that Davida's baby was slightly breached, Pete had stepped in, gave her a slight chiropractic move that changed her position, and the baby had slid out as clean and easy as poop from a dog. Pete was now being hailed as the hero of the day by several of the older men. I didn't know you were an obstetrician, said Roland. I'm not, said Pete, but I wish I could hand out cigars. Here, have a dog biscuit instead. James looked over at the mob surrounding Davida. Davida was still lying back. She had a strange, serene expression on her face. She looked up at the sky and said something softly in Polish. Jill poured water gently over her forehead. Go figure, said James eventually to Claire. Are you still planning to move to Boston? He asked. Yes, she said. Yahoo, said James, and he threw his hat up and then caught it. In a minute, Claire looked up at him. Sure is hot. Want to take the dog swimming, she said. I might jump in myself. Yes, but I don't have a suit, James said. I don't have one either, Claire said, but it's not going to stop me, James smiled. You know how to make an old man happy, he said. You're not that old, said Claire, exaggerating her words. They decided James would drive. They walked out to his truck, loaded the dogs in the back. Claire started to climb into the cab, but James pulled her back by her shirt. I have to get in first, he said, a little embarrassed. My lock is busted on the driver's side. You got to get that thing fixed, she said. I know, he said as he entered on her side, and she followed. They drove slowly away just as the ambulance to take Davida and her new baby away pulled into the driveway. That's it.
Anyone have any questions?
Are there any UFO sightings in the dog park?
That's a good question. We were talking about that the other day. There's always ideas at the dog park. How can we, can we bring a sound system in? Can we, have a warming house? Can we have, and there's the conversation can get quite interesting. I don't know though. Actually, we seem there. It's right by the airport. And this is actually South County. I shouldn't say we and it because this, there's nobody in here that I know that was in this book, but I'm making a joke. It's when you write a book and if you have people that are villains or anything, you worry because the villains are, turn out to be some of the nicest people you ever met. And all of a sudden you've written a book that's, not so nice for them. But anyway, sorry, I don't know actually if there have been.
But there are none in the book.
They're not in the book. That's a funny question. So.
Seeing as you write mostly poetry, how much of this did Willie write?
That's a good question. He was always around. But Paul, I don't know, man.
Does he type?
See,
How big an editor is he?
he can work the internet better than I can. I don't know. He's better on that side of things, but I'm not very good at it. Yeah, he types with his tail, you know. He's got real dexterity. Anyway, so thanks a lot, everybody. Appreciate it a lot.